There are families who inherit land. There are families who inherit wealth. And then there are families who inherit something else entirely. In the autumn of 1998, a locked archive room inside a small Tennessee church was opened for the first time in nearly 30 years. The box was labeled simply, Adams, Restricted. Inside were brittle letters, a priest's private journal, medical reports, and one final envelope marked in red ink, "Do not attempt the rite again." What those documents described was not folklore. It was not campfire storytelling. It was not the legend most people think they know. It was a bloodline, and it was still active. According to church records from Robertson County, Tennessee, the Adams family had lived on the same stretch of land for over 180 years. The property bordered what locals once called the Red River Settlement. In the early 1800s, that area became infamous for a violent haunting that history would later name the Bell Witch Case. Most people know the legend. A restless spirit, knocking on walls, a voice in the dark, a man who died under mysterious circumstances. But the Bell family was not the only family there. The Adams family lived less than a mile away. Their name rarely appears in published accounts, but it appears repeatedly in private ones. The first mention comes from a handwritten note dated March 1821, signed by a Reverend Thomas Caldwell. In it, he describes visiting the Adams cabin after reports of night disturbances. He writes, "The children wake screaming. They claim a woman stands at the foot of the bed. The father insists it is hysteria. The mother refuses to speak in my presence." That note was dismissed as stress brought on by the widespread panic surrounding the Bell property. But it was not the last. Over the next 50 years, scattered documentation shows a pattern. Adams' children experiencing night terrors, sudden illnesses with no diagnosis, livestock found dead without injury, and always one recurring detail: a woman's voice. Not loud, not violent, whispering. In 1874, a midwife named Clara Jenkins submitted a sworn statement to the county clerk. She had been called to assist with the birth of a child named Mary Adams. The labor, she reported, was normal. But after the birth, as the child cried, Clara heard another voice in the room. She believed it was the mother speaking, until she realized the mother had fainted. Clara wrote that the voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It said only one sentence: "She is mine." The record ends there. Mary Adams survived infancy. She married. She had children. And nothing unusual was recorded about her adulthood until her youngest son turned 13. In 1903, local physician Dr. Harold Green documented what he described as catatonic episodes affecting the boy, Samuel Adams. The episodes began with staring spells, then muttering, then long stretches of silence. During one house call, Dr. Green reported that Samuel suddenly spoke in a tone inconsistent with his age. The boy reportedly told the doctor, "You should not touch what belongs to me." The doctor attributed it to neurological disorder. He prescribed rest. Samuel died 2 years later from what was recorded as fever complications. The pattern continued. Generations passed. The land remained in the family. And every 2 or 3 decades, one member, usually entering adolescence, would begin to show signs. Night paralysis, voices, unexplained knowledge, a growing hostility toward religious objects. By the 1950s, the Adams family had stopped speaking about it publicly. Neighbors described them as quiet but normal. Church attendance was irregular but not absent. There were no police reports, no public scandals. But in 1967, something changed. According to archived parish documents from St. Luke's Church in Springfield, Tennessee, a man named William Adams requested a private meeting with Father Richard Halley. William was 39 years old, a father of 3, a factory worker with no prior history of mental illness. He told Father Halley that his daughter, Eleanor, had begun speaking to someone at night. At first, he assumed it was imagination. But Eleanor was 16, and the voice she responded to was not imaginary. William claimed he heard it too. Soft, close, female, calling his daughter by name. Father Halley initially advised psychological evaluation. The church required medical clearance before any spiritual intervention. Eleanor was examined by 2 physicians and a psychiatrist over the next 4 months. The findings were inconclusive. No signs of psychosis. No drug use. No epilepsy. Her EEG results were normal. But her behavior grew more disturbing. She began refusing food blessed at church. She developed bruises along her arms that appeared overnight. She wrote phrases repeatedly in a small notebook. She walks beside me. She says I was promised. It started before I was born. When asked who she was, Eleanor would become silent. Or smile. In December of 1967, Father Halley conducted a private prayer session at the Adams home. He later recorded the event in his personal journal. He described Eleanor as calm when he arrived. Polite. Cooperative. But the atmosphere in the house felt heavy. He wrote, "There is a stillness here that does not belong to winter." As he began reading from the Gospel of John, Eleanor's breathing changed. Slow at first, then shallow. Without opening her eyes, she whispered, "You have no authority here." The priest continued. The room temperature reportedly dropped. William Adams later testified that frost formed briefly on the inside of the bedroom window despite the furnace running. Father Halley pressed on with prayer. Eleanor's body stiffened. Her hands curled inward, as if gripping something unseen. Then she spoke again, this time in a voice that was not her own. Lower, measured, ancient in tone. "She belongs to us. The land remembers. The blood remembers." The priest stopped the session. He left the home shaken. In his journal, he underlined one sentence twice. "This is not oppression. This is claim." The church hesitated to authorize a formal exorcism. The Vatican guidelines were strict. Cases of possession required clear signs: xenoglossy, knowledge beyond natural means, aversion to sacred objects, superhuman strength. Eleanor began exhibiting 3 of the 4. She identified a visiting deacon's hidden sin during a brief encounter, a detail later confirmed privately by church officials. She spoke phrases in what a linguist later identified as archaic Scottish dialect, despite no known exposure. And during a second prayer attempt, she reportedly threw her father across the room with force disproportionate to her size. Still, authorization was delayed. Then came February 3, 1968. At approximately 2:17 a.m., neighbors reported screaming from the Adams property. Sheriff's deputies arrived to find William Adams unconscious on the porch. Inside, furniture had been overturned. Windows shattered inward. Eleanor was found in her bedroom, sitting upright on the bed. Smiling, her mother, Ruth Adams, was kneeling in the hallway, clutching a crucifix so tightly that the metal had cut into her palm. When deputies attempted to escort Eleanor outside, she reportedly began laughing. Not loudly, but steadily. One deputy later stated under oath that the laughter did not match the girl's mouth movements. The church granted emergency permission for the rite of exorcism. Father Halley was assigned. He was joined by Father Miguel Serrano, a visiting priest with prior experience assisting in 2 documented possession cases in South America. The rite began on February 6th. It would last 9 days. According to official church transcripts, the first 2 days showed minimal reaction. Eleanor appeared withdrawn but responsive. On the 3rd night, as Father Serrano recited the Litany of the Saints, Eleanor's body arched backward at an angle described as biomechanically improbable. Witnesses reported a voice interrupting the prayer, not from her mouth, but from the corner of the room. The recording device placed on the dresser captured a faint whisper. When enhanced decades later, the phrase became clear. "We were here before the bells." The mention of the Bell family startled Father Halley. He had grown up hearing the legend, but this was the first time the name surfaced during the rite. On the 5th night, Eleanor spoke at length. She described events from 1817 in vivid detail. The death of a man named John Bell, the sickness, the vial of liquid, the voice claiming responsibility. Historical accuracy in her descriptions was later verified against archival records not accessible to the public at that time. When asked how she knew these things, she responded, "I was there." The priests pressed further. "Who are you?" Silence filled the room. Then, softly, "I am what was invited." The temperature dropped again. Candles flickered violently, though no windows were open. Father Serrano later stated in a written testimony that he felt a presence not singular, but layered. The rite intensified. On the 8th night, Eleanor's restraint snapped. She stood, her eyes unfocused, and she pointed directly at Father Halley. "You carry doubt," she said, "and doubt is permission." The priest faltered, just briefly, but long enough. The lights went out. In complete darkness, witnesses reported hearing movement across the ceiling. Scraping. Slow. Deliberate. When power returned seconds later, Eleanor was no longer on the bed. She was standing behind the priests, smiling. The 9th day ended in partial success. Eleanor collapsed after a prolonged final invocation. Her body went limp. Her pulse weakened, then stabilized. When she regained consciousness hours later, she had no memory of the previous week. The church declared the possession terminated. The Adams family was instructed to vacate the property. They refused. William Adams insisted the land had belonged to his family for generations. They stayed. For 6 years, nothing significant was reported. Eleanor graduated high school. She moved to Nashville. She married. She had a son. And for a while, it seemed the bloodline had been cleansed. Until 1974, when Eleanor's son turned 13. According to the final envelope in the church archive, the first sign was the drawings. A woman without eyes, standing beside a river, watching. And beneath the drawing, written in a child's handwriting, she says, "We never left." The envelope ends with a final notation from Father Halley, dated October 14, 1974. "I fear we misunderstood the nature of the claim. It was never about a single soul. It was about inheritance." And below that, written in ink darker than the rest, "The bloodline remains open." The drawings were discovered on a Sunday afternoon. Eleanor had driven back to her childhood home in Robertson County for her father's birthday. The farmhouse looked smaller than she remembered. The paint was peeling. The air felt heavier than it should have for early October. Her son, Daniel, had wandered off shortly after arriving. He was 13 years old. Quiet. Observant. A boy who preferred sketchbooks to conversation. When Eleanor found him in what used to be her bedroom, he was sitting cross-legged on the floor with a pencil in his hand. He did not look up when she entered. He was drawing the river. The Red River. But Daniel had never been told about the property's proximity to it. The river sat half a mile beyond a line of trees, mostly hidden from the house. He had never walked that far alone. On the page, the water curved in the exact shape it did in real life. Beside it stood a woman. Her hair long. Her dress outdated. Her eyes missing. Eleanor's throat tightened. "Where did you see this?" she asked. Daniel paused. Then he answered without hesitation. "She showed me." The tone of his voice was wrong. Flat. Certain. Eleanor felt something stir in her memory. A cold space she had buried for years. She told herself it was coincidence. She told herself children imagine things. But then Daniel turned the page. On the next sheet, the farmhouse was drawn. Not as it stood now, but as it had looked in the early 1800s. The front porch narrower. The chimney positioned differently. The fencing incomplete. Architectural details that had not existed for over a century. "Who told you about this house?" Eleanor asked quietly. Daniel looked at her. She did. That night, Daniel refused to sleep in the guest room. He insisted on staying in Eleanor's old bedroom. He said it felt familiar. At 2:11 a.m., Eleanor woke to the sound of whispering. Not loud, not frantic, measured. She thought at first it was the wind pushing through cracks in the old walls. But the windows were closed. The whispering carried a rhythm, like conversation. She stepped into the hallway. Daniel's bedroom door was slightly open. The room was dark, but she could hear him responding. Yes. A pause. No. Another pause. I understand. Eleanor pushed the door open. Daniel was sitting upright in the bed, eyes open, staring at the far corner of the room. There was nothing there. "What are you doing?" she whispered. Daniel did not look at her. "She says you remember," he replied. The word remember landed heavily. Fragments of 1968 stirred in Eleanor's mind. The freezing air, the prayers, the sense of being watched from inside her own thoughts. But she remembered nothing clearly. Only sensations. Father Halley had told her it was mercy not to remember. Daniel slowly turned his head toward her. "She says you promised." The next morning, Eleanor insisted they leave. William Adams resisted. He believed in coincidence, in overreaction. He believed that fear created its own evidence. But when Daniel walked past the dining table and muttered, "He still keeps the vial," William went silent. There had been a vial. In 1968, during the height of Eleanor's possession, she had described a small glass container buried near the riverbank. According to historical accounts of the original Bell Witch case, John Bell had allegedly been poisoned with an unknown substance found in a vial. The Adams properties shared the same river, the same soil. William had searched for such an object once. And he had found something. Not a vial, but a shard of glass near the waterline. He had never told Eleanor. He had certainly never told Daniel. Within a week, Daniel's behavior shifted. He stopped drawing. He stopped speaking at school. Teachers reported that he stared at walls during class. When addressed, he responded politely but vaguely. Medical evaluation followed. Neurological scans. Blood tests. Psychiatric assessment. No abnormalities. No trauma indicators. The psychiatrist noted mild dissociation but nothing severe enough to justify institutional care. Then came the sleep disturbances. Daniel began waking at precisely 3:03 a.m. Every night. He would walk to the hallway and stand facing Eleanor's bedroom door. Not knocking. Not speaking. Just standing. One night, Eleanor opened the door before he could reach it. He was already there. Eyes open. Breathing steady. "She says tonight is important," he whispered. "Who says?" "The one you left behind." Eleanor contacted St. Luke's Church. Father Richard Halley had passed away in 1972 from heart failure. The parish had been reassigned to a younger priest, Father Thomas Brennan. Eleanor hesitated to explain everything. But when she mentioned her maiden name, there was a pause on the line. "I've seen references," Father Brennan said carefully. "Old files." They met 2 days later. Eleanor described the drawings. The whispering. The vile comment. Father Brennan listened without interruption. Then he retrieved a thin folder from a locked drawer. Inside were copies of Father Halley's final notes. One page had been underlined repeatedly. It was never about a single soul. It was about inheritance. Father Brennan folded his hands. The church believed their right in 1968 ended an active possession. But Father Halley expressed concern that something else remained. Remained where? Eleanor asked. In the family. Daniel's case did not immediately meet the threshold for a formal exorcism. There were no violent outbursts. No overt aversion to sacred objects. No documented xenoglossy. But subtle indicators began to accumulate. During a quiet prayer session at the church, Daniel reportedly flinched before Father Brennan spoke certain Latin phrases. He whispered the next lines under his breath before the priest could finish them. When asked how he knew the words, Daniel replied, "She's patient. She teaches." The atmosphere in the Adams home deteriorated. Electrical disturbances became common. Clocks stopped at 3:03. Family photographs fell from walls without visible cause. William began hearing footsteps in the attic. There was no attic, just crawl space insulation. One evening, Daniel approached his grandfather and asked a question in a calm, curious tone. "Do you regret not digging deeper?" William felt his stomach tighten. "Digging where?" he asked. "By the river." Daniel smiled slightly. "She says you were close." That night, William walked alone toward the Red River. The moon was thin, the ground damp. He carried a shovel. He did not fully understand why he felt compelled to go. He later described it as pressure behind the eyes. a suggestion rather than a command. He reached the riverbank near the cluster of sycamore trees where he had once found the glass shard decades earlier. The soil felt loose. He began digging. After 15 minutes, the shovel struck something hard. Not stone. Not wood. Glass. He knelt and brushed away the dirt. A small vial emerged, clouded with age. Sealed. Inside was a dark residue. William felt a cold rush through his arms. A whisper brushed his ear. "You found me." He dropped the vial. The glass did not shatter. Instead, it rolled slightly toward the water's edge. William stumbled backward. When he looked up, he saw a shape standing across the river. A silhouette. Feminine. Still. He blinked. It was gone. He left the vial where it lay. The next morning, Daniel was different. His posture straighter. His voice clearer. He approached Eleanor at breakfast and said. He disturbed it. "Disturbed what?" she asked. "The agreement." Eleanor's breath caught. "What agreement?" Daniel tilted his head slightly. "The one made when he refused to surrender the land." The land. Always the land. Historical records regarding the original bell witch haunting describe disputes over property lines, over trade deals, over perceived betrayal. Some folklore suggests that a woman named Kate Batts cursed the Bell family over a land disagreement. But in private church correspondence from 1968, Father Serrano had written something more unsettling. "This presence does not speak like vengeance alone. It speaks like contract." On October 19, 1974, Daniel's behavior escalated. During dinner, he began reciting a series of dates. Then he added a new one. William asked what the numbers meant. Daniel replied, "Cycles." That night at 3:03 a.m., the whispering grew louder. Eleanor woke to the sound of something dragging across the hallway floor. She opened her door slowly. Daniel stood at the end of the corridor. But he was not alone. A shadow stretched beside him, longer than his body, detached from any light source. It moved independently. Eleanor felt pressure in her ears. Daniel's mouth opened, but the voice that emerged was layered. Two tones speaking in unison. "You thought distance would dissolve it." The hallway light flickered violently. William rushed from his room. The shadow snapped back into Daniel's frame like smoke inhaled. Daniel collapsed. Unconscious. Medical intervention followed immediately. Hospital admission. Continuous monitoring. No seizures recorded. No abnormal brain activity. But at exactly 3:03 a.m., the cardiac monitor spiked. Daniel's eyes opened, and he spoke clearly to the nurse on duty. "Tell the priest he cannot close what was opened in blood." The nurse later confirmed that Daniel had not been informed about any priest involvement. Father Brennan requested authorization from the diocese for preliminary rites of investigation. This time, the church responded more quickly. The Adams file had been reopened, cross-referenced with archived materials regarding the early 19th century disturbances near the Bell property. A historian consulted by the diocese noted an overlooked detail. One branch of the Adams family had intermarried with distant relatives of the Batts family in the late 1700s. A connection. Faint, but present. If folklore held any truth, and if it was a curse, had originated from a grievance tied to land and blood, then the Adams line might not have been collateral. They might have been conduit. On November 2, 1974, Father Brennan visited Daniel in the hospital with holy water concealed in a small vial. He did not announce it. He merely approached the bed. Daniel's eyes were closed. As the priest began a quiet prayer internally, Daniel's lips moved. "You brought it again." Father Brennan stopped. He had not spoken aloud. Daniel's eyes opened, black pupils fixed directly on the priest. "You never understood the first time," the layered voice said softly. "We are not passing through." The room temperature dropped sharply. Frost formed along the inside of the window. The heart monitor flatlined for 3 seconds, then resumed. Daniel's expression softened. The pupils returned to normal. He looked confused. "Why are you here?" he asked weakly. Father Brennan stepped back, and for the first time, He considered that Father Halley's warning had not been caution. It had been incomplete understanding. Because if the presence was not occupying, if it was not intruding, then it was something else entirely. Something tied to blood.
To soil.
To a promise made long before anyone alive could remember. And that meant removing it would not be as simple as command. It would require breaking something that had never truly been severed. That night, as hospital security reviewed camera footage from Daniel's room, they noticed something that none of them could explain. At 3:03 a.m., as Daniel lay motionless in bed, the shadow beside him did not align with his body. It stood independently, watching. And just before the footage cut to static, the shadow turned toward the camera, as if aware it was being observed.